December 11, 1941. In Berlin, beneath low winter clouds and the echo of boots on stone, Adolf Hitler stood before the Reichstag and declared war on the United States. For many Germans listening by radio, the announcement did not ignite fear or excitement, but confusion. America, to them, was distant, industrial, loud, a land of movies and machines, not soldiers. In barracks, factories, and bomb shelters, the question whispered itself into existence almost immediately. What kind of men would America send to fight a European war they barely understood? That uncertainty, more than hatred, defined German perceptions of American soldiers in the early years of World War II, and it would slowly transform as the hidden mechanisms of the war ground forward in silence and shadow. Before American boots ever touched European soil, German intelligence had already built an image of the American soldier that was deeply flawed. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, studied U.S. society through films, newspapers, and embassy reports. Their analysts concluded that Americans were physically large but psychologically soft, spoiled by comfort, incapable of enduring sustained hardship. German propaganda reinforced this idea relentlessly. American soldiers were depicted as disorganized, racially divided, obsessed with luxury, dependent on machines rather than courage. Many German officers believed that once confronted by the harsh realities of mechanized European warfare, American morale would collapse. This belief was not simply arrogance, it was a dangerous misreading shaped by cultural blindness and wishful thinking, quietly encouraged by a regime that needed confidence more than truth. Yet beneath official doctrine, private doubts already existed. Some older German officers remembered American troops from the final year of the First World War. They remembered their size, their logistical reach, and the unsettling speed with which they learned. Those memories lingered like an unspoken warning. In officers' messes and staff meetings, there were murmurs that America's real strength was not bravery or ideology, but something far more threatening: endless production and the ability to replace losses without flinching. Still, these concerns rarely reached the frontline soldier, who absorbed a steady diet of propaganda portraying Americans as clumsy amateurs, destined to be crushed by seasoned Wehrmacht units. The first real encounters shattered the illusion quietly, without dramatic declarations. In North Africa, in late 1942, German Afrika Korps troops under Erwin Rommel met American forces for the first time in combat. Initially, the German assessments seemed confirmed. American units were inexperienced, poorly coordinated, prone to panic under concentrated fire. German reports described them as energetic but naive, brave in moments but tactically careless. After battles like Kasserine Pass, many German soldiers laughed openly at the idea that these men could ever threaten Europe. Letters home mocked American uniforms, their abundance of food, their reliance on vehicles. Yet hidden in those same reports were notes that would later prove prophetic. The Americans adapted with alarming speed. Within months, German frontline intelligence began to shift in tone. American units returned to battle reorganized, better led, supported by overwhelming artillery and air power. German soldiers noticed something unsettling. American soldiers did not fight like Europeans. They advanced behind walls of steel and fire, using radios to coordinate movements with an efficiency that felt alien. When losses occurred, replacements arrived quickly, often better trained than the men they replaced. German troops, stretched thin and increasingly isolated, began to sense that they were facing not just soldiers, but an entire industrial civilization moving against them with mechanical patience. This realization deepened as the war expanded into an intelligence conflict fought far from the front lines. German counterintelligence became obsessed with understanding the American psyche. Captured American soldiers were interrogated extensively, not just about unit positions, but about morale, beliefs, fears, and motivations. The results puzzled German interrogators. Many Americans expressed little ideological hatred for Germany. They spoke instead of duty, of wanting to survive, of finishing the war quickly. This disturbed Nazi officials who had framed the conflict as an existential racial struggle. The absence of fanaticism made Americans unpredictable. They were not driven by desperation or revenge, but by momentum. German soldiers began to notice another unnerving trait. Americans surrendered rarely when they believed relief was possible, but did so pragmatically when surrounded. There was no shame in survival. To German troops indoctrinated with notions of honor and sacrifice, this was both contemptible and enviable. Quietly, some began to question whether ideology had blinded them to a more effective way of waging war. These thoughts remained unspoken, buried beneath fear of reprisal, but they spread silently, soldier to soldier, trench to trench. By 1943, the image of the American soldier inside Germany had split into two conflicting visions. Propaganda still portrayed them as decadent occupiers in waiting, while frontline reports increasingly described them as relentless and methodical. German civilians experiencing the bombing campaign began to associate Americans not with cowardice, but with thunder from the sky. The U.S. Army Air Forces conducted daylight bombing raids that terrified German cities, flying directly into flak and fighter opposition. To German civilians watching silver formations cross the sky, American soldiers became distant, faceless agents of destruction, immune to fear, protected by altitude and numbers. The psychological effect was profound. Behind the scenes, psychological warfare units on both sides studied these reactions carefully. The Americans dropped leaflets over German cities, promising fair treatment to those who surrendered, emphasizing survival over sacrifice. German soldiers read them in secret. Some scoffed, others hid them in their pockets. As conditions worsened, the idea that Americans treated prisoners well became one of the most powerful weapons in the Allied arsenal. German high command feared this more than bullets. Orders were issued to confiscate leaflets and punish defeatist talk, but belief cannot be unlearned once planted. When American troops landed in Italy and later in Normandy, the German perception shifted decisively. Reports from Normandy described American infantry advancing steadily under withering fire, supported by naval guns that shook the earth itself. German soldiers began referring to American units not with mockery, but with cautious respect. They noted their aggressiveness in patrols, their willingness to fight at night, their refusal to be intimidated by losses. One recurring observation appeared in German after-action reports. Americans were dangerous because they believed the war was winnable. That belief, unshaken by years of attrition, made them terrifyingly persistent. In the hedgerows of France, German soldiers encountered American soldiers up close, face to face, often at distances measured in meters. The myth of softness dissolved completely. Americans were frightened, yes, but they advanced anyway. They shouted, cursed, joked under fire. They carried photographs of home, chocolate in their pockets, and letters from families thousands of miles away. To Germans who had been at war for years, hardened by loss and exhaustion, this combination of humanity and endurance was deeply unsettling. It suggested a reservoir of emotional energy Germany no longer possessed. As the war dragged into its final phase, German perceptions darkened further. The Battle of the Bulge in late 1944 exposed both sides to extreme conditions. German soldiers initially celebrated their surprise offensive, believing American units would collapse under pressure. Instead, they encountered stubborn resistance, especially from isolated American units that refused to surrender despite being surrounded. The defense of Bastogne became legendary even among German troops. Reports described Americans fighting on with little food or ammunition, sustained by airdrops and sheer defiance. The belief that Americans lacked staying power died completely in the frozen forests of the Ardennes. By 1945, the German view of American soldiers had become painfully clear and deeply ironic. They were no longer seen as inferior or decadent, but as representatives of a system that could absorb shock endlessly. German soldiers began to fear capture by the Soviets far more than by Americans. This fear drove thousands to flee westward, abandoning positions to surrender to U.S. forces. In those final months, American soldiers became, in German eyes, symbols of survival rather than annihilation. This shift was not born of admiration, but of exhaustion and realism. German civilians encountering American troops after surrender often experienced a final psychological shock. The feared occupiers arrived with discipline, organization, and an unexpected restraint. They handed out food, enforced order, and followed rules that contradicted years of propaganda. For many Germans, this was the most disturbing revelation of all. The enemy they had been taught to despise did not behave as monsters. This realization forced a reckoning not just with defeat, but with deception. The war had not ended with clarity, but with questions that would echo for generations. In the end, what Germans really thought about American soldiers was never a single belief, but an evolving confrontation between illusion and reality. It began with arrogance, passed through confusion and fear, and ended in reluctant respect shaped by defeat. Hidden beneath the battles and headlines was a psychological war that stripped away myths on both sides. American soldiers were not invincible heroes or foofish amateurs. They were human beings backed by an industrial, logistical, and ideological force that Germany had fatally underestimated. That miscalculation, more than any single battle, helped decide the fate of the war long before the last shot was fired.